That may not be the last reference to 976, but it might be.
Tough. Yeah, it's tough.
Well, I think that's a fairly hard act to follow. But Bob is going to come and talk to us about the history of good repair from 1958 when he was hired. You know, it may or may not have been a mistake by the highway department, but from 1958 when he was hired until 1989 when he mustered out as the assistant secretary for highways and the chief highway engineer. So this history is really valuable because the numbers we now have in terms of how much underfunding there is, because of Roger Millar standing up and talking about it quite publicly for a couple years now, and refining the numbers as he goes, gives us the dimensions. But the duration is a function of how long ago did we stop adequately funding good repair. And I thought that it happened on Bob's watch, but he is here to tell us that in 1989 when he mustered out, we were still doing good repair. So Bob, please inform us.
Thank you, Will, and good to see all of you here, and I want to thank the union here for this excellent facility. I'm going to be talking quite a bit about history and not all that much about what happened in the last 2 decades, 2 or 3 maybe. When I went to work in '58, well, I'll start even before that. In 1956, President Eisenhower passed anyhow, he got the interstate highway system approved. And from that time, even to here, the highway construction particularly has been centered around the interstate. I offer you Tacoma for that. And so a lot of my history is the interstate, and I'll try to kind of keep off of that and talk about the local roads. My first few years in the department, I was busy designing things for Interstate 5. When I first signed in 1958, the first pier for the bridge across Lake Union was just being built. So I've been through a lot of it. I was a design engineer at first. I got promoted to being a project engineer on one in the south end of town and one in the north end of town. And I just never got around to maintenance and improvement of the highways, and that it was 100% interstate. But in 1967, I transferred to Yakima and spent 18 years there. The first 3 I was known as the recon engineer, which was what my little unit did there was to investigate places where highways needed to be rerouted. And that, in those days, we had the money to do that. Of course, it didn't cost as much as it does now, but we checked even the interstate. We were responsible for putting the interstate over on the other side of the valley. There's a lot of there was a lot of conversation about that, and we did the Highway 395 north of the Tri-Cities, Moxie bypass, and things like that. So those really took the place of that we didn't need enough money. We didn't need a lot of money for for what we're talking about now, because a lot of that was covered by highway projects that we had enough to do. After that, I became what they called the location engineer, which is responsible for producing the plans to do those jobs. And that's about the time I think I came to my first meeting of the Good Roads Association. I think it was in Yakima, but it could have been on this side of the state. I can't remember. I don't remember anything very well, so if I stutter a little bit, you'll have to excuse me. And then in the last 10 years, from 75 to 85, I became what they called then the district engineer, the head guy in the Yakima district, which was then called, it wasn't called a region then, it was a district. And I got into quite a bit of this sort of thing, but it was still, there wasn't a lot of problem that I heard from the maintenance engineers or anybody that, or even the legislature, that we had a problem with maintenance. And we were able to do, as far as I can remember, all of the improvement of highways that needed it, and we had the money to do it. In 1985, I got transferred to headquarters with that lofty name that Will just named off. And I'm back there then, away from the people that actually oversee the highway building and oversee the budgeting. I spent a lot of time on meetings throughout the U.S. But I learned a lot of things about what other states were doing, and as far as I was concerned, ours was doing as well or better than the rest of them. The main thing, let me look at my notes here. The legislature, of course I got wound up with them sometimes, but it was both the Democrats and the Republicans supported the Department of Transportation, and there wasn't a big problem in getting things passed that needed to be passed. And I think probably the reason for that is that the interstate still took a lot of the money. I think that may be a reason why we're not getting the money, is because even on an interstate project, it has to be met with state money also. And I think that the legislature got used to that and just didn't need to until most of the interstate was finished. I'm not going to be able to take up my whole half an hour, but I wondered if you had any questions. Yes?
So, you actually started in this business, I guess, 4 years earlier than I did. I started at Caltrans and worked my way up here. But you and I were in the beginning of the interstate highway system explosion across the nation, and including in the state of Washington. The Interstate Highway Act funded 90% of the interstate construction, and the states had to come up with 10%. Well, 10% sounds like a small number until you see the size of the number, because we were, at that time, building massive highway systems around the state. But the department built a department to handle 100% of those contracts. So you had a massive amount of federal money coming in to support the construction of the interstate system. And in my mind, that probably allowed the State Department to almost think of maintenance as a slush fund that's kind of a little thing over here in the corner, and they can do it just fine. But then once the interstate highway system in the 80s got pretty much built out, that federal 90% funding diminished dramatically. It's not gone away entirely, but it seems to me that that's a very critical part of the story as to why the state is now struggling to come up with the amount of money that it takes to maintain the system, is that it's a much bigger portion of the whole department's exercise than it was when we were building tens and hundreds of miles of interstate highway a year. Would you, I think I supported what you just said, but is that somewhere near right?
Yeah, I think that has a lot to do with it, Vic, but would you say your main question again?
Well, does the transform of the department's finances from an interstate highway construction system that's getting 90% federal money to a state highway system that's only getting 30% federal money or some smaller portion, does that have an impact on the maintenance and preservation?
It does, but you know, there's still, the interstate system is still being improved. But a lot of other things are being improved too, like the tunnel under Seattle and that type of thing. And it all costs money. And I think it's hard for the legislature to get used to the fact that we need more money. And they don't hear much about maintenance and improvement. So I don't know why they don't. I don't know. They must have been told about the bridges that are failing, and I can't understand why they can't figure out a way to fix that. And we need to be that. We need to keep poking them with a sharp stick.
Well, we have the benefit of the brains of Senator Hobbs' office here with us, so perhaps at some point today she could just answer that question and then we'll know. Are there other questions for Bob?
Yeah.
Well, go ahead, Scott, you and then Mike.
Addressing what Vic said, one of the things that I learned working for departments of transportation almost 2 decades ago now is that the attitude of the leadership in the Department of Transportation 20 years ago in most states was that they have a responsibility for maintaining and expanding the state highway system. And so many states spent years trying to unload all of the local roads that they managed, right? They spent a long time trying to understand the function of the state highway system, and they planned for the growth of the state highway system to accommodate population growth. And so if you take a look at a state like Wisconsin, they developed a 20-year plan to 4-lane, 800 miles of rural 2-lane highways to improve safety and mobility in the state of Wisconsin. In the state of Washington, my observation is that long-range highway planning is not happening. Corridor planning is not happening to the same degree that it was 10 years ago. It seems like the priorities of the department have shifted away from actually being at least caretakers of the highway system, let alone stewards of the highway system. And I'm wondering if you think that is as much a political problem as it is a problem of priorities and leadership and administrative choices inside the Washington State Department of Transportation.
I don't think it was when I was there. It may be a part of the problem now. The department puts out we have a planning, or had a planning department. They may still have a planning department. They put forth a plan about that big, and I think it goes back on the shelf. So because there isn't enough money to do that plan.
Well, can I ask a question about the increment in time between 1956 and the build-out of the system, and now a system that has been in operation as a wasting asset for 40 years? How much, I mean, I'm assuming that when you first build a system, you can have a pothole the first day. We did down in the Alaska Way Tunnel. But the fact of the matter is, it would seem that you would have much less maintenance expense early on in the process than you do 40 years on. And did you have, as Chief Highway Engineer, any kind of focus at the time about what the curve would look like for preservation and maintenance over time?
Yeah, we knew that was happening, and that came into the planning stage too. But I think that people didn't realize how much it would be if you let it go too long.
Mike, you had a question?
Yeah, history question. In the late 70s, early 80s, Washington State built the first major parts of its HOV network, which was the longest in the country. A lot of that, perhaps most of it, was done by squeezing the HOV lane into the left margins and shoulders with some spot concrete paving. But do you remember, was there any dogfight over that space on the deck of Interstate 5 when those were being put in? What was the mindset within WashDOT about whether to put 4 lanes in a 3-lane road deck?
I remember that when we first built the interstate from Seattle, or south of Seattle in particular, it only had three lanes, and they expected to need 4 lanes quite a lot in the future, but it turned out to be about five years or so. And from that time on, they had limited width to work with, so they started to scratch and reduce the shoulder width and that sort of thing. And the addition to HOV lanes, for instance, is taking up a lot more space.
Yeah. So the HOV lane was put in areas that you guys foresaw as the 4th general lane.
Even on our state highways that weren't interstate, it got to the point where we could not reach the plan for that phase of the highway like a major arterial, and there were some lower approvals that we could go to, so we did. And sometimes we didn't have the shoulder that we should have, and we did quite a bit of that.
Yeah.
And the tail end of my
How about through Shoreline and Northgate in those areas where they didn't build extra space for the 4th lane?
Say that again?
In Shoreline and Northgate in 1965 when the freeway opened, it was laid out for 3 lanes. The shoulders, I think, were actually weaker material. Was there a tough decision up on that side of town?
I don't know. Any more questions?
Well, let me just probe you a little bit about the adequacy of the funding you had when you were the chief highway engineer. And that was a period of time that was fairly early on still with the completed highway system. So you weren't facing excessive maintenance for decades of not funding it. But was there anything about the appropriation process in terms of how the slush fund for preservation and maintenance was provided that gave you more flexibility as to how to allocate it than now, or do you know?
I really don't know, Will. What we had was adequate even when I was over in Yakima for 18 years. I can't say I can't say that that there was some inadequacy, because there never is enough money. Usually when you need a project, it goes 10 years before it gets funded, and it goes 5 or 6 more years through the environmental process. And by the time we get it built, it needs to be bigger.
Bill,
Getting to something that Scott brought up.
you have to speak up, Bill.
What's that?
You have to speak up.
Okay.
Especially for me.
I used to be with the Puget Sound Council of Governments, and we were part of the team that wound up taking a lot of the freeways off the regional plan because of major freeway revolt. They didn't like the R.H. Thompson and a few others, and we thought we were running out of oil. There was a forecast from the Fed that said by 2000 we were at the tail end of oil discoveries. It was downhill. Anyway, since that time, the Puget Sound Regional Council, at some time they changed Puget Sound Regional Council. At some point, about middle 80s, they abandoned the process of doing true multimodal planning. We would do the multimodal planning in that agency, and we'd say where the transit was and where the highways were and how much highway we needed, with support from the state, of course. At some point, the DOT decided that they would take that in-house. The regional planning agency would not do their regional planning. So as a result, and same thing for Sound Transit, they let Sound Transit do the rail planning. So as a result, we don't have any agency that is unfettered or objective that does true multimodal transportation planning. And that's why we don't have a plan for the future. We don't have a decent highway plan because of that problem.
Yeah,
You may be
you're
aware.
probably right, but I don't know about it, because I haven't really kept up on it that much, except through this organization.
Bruce?
I think sitting here where we were when Bob was telling us today, he set the foundation. And you can't help but think about what's gone on the last 25 years, or turn of the millennium, the sensitivity of the population about the environment, and therefore the legislators and the governors pay attention to the environment, and it just put a hydrogen bomb in the pot of money for roads. And I believe people here, some people could tell me more exactly, but the court ruling that the court has labor put on the DOT to clean up the culverts and throughout the state, and it's hundreds of millions of dollars, and DOT is, I think, choking on it, taking one bite at a time to do this. And there's other things environmental that are considered that are just chewing up the money where there's no capacity. So I think that's an impact that we just can't. What we're fighting for is repairs and maintenance that has gone away in terms of a magnitude that it should be. And also the design of capacity in certain areas in the state. So it's a big deal.
Well, let me try to turn that into a question, if I could, for Bob, so as to tap into your experience in leading the department in the 1980s. How much attention was given by the department to the environmental aspects of building highways? Was was it greater by the 1980s than it had been in 1958 when you started? Or were we still not focused on the environment when we built highways and not focused on highways when we were trying to clean up the environment?
We didn't give much interest in the environment at all up until 1970 when the Environmental Act was passed.
Right.
And since then, it's been a thorn. I would guess, and the culverts and so forth, it, like Bruce says, it all uses up money. I've estimated a couple of times that if all of the environmental things that need to be covered are added to just the construction cost, it probably makes the construction cost 50% higher. But that's only my, I didn't have a committee working out something on that. That's just what I think happens.
And did you start seeing during the 1980s circumstances change so that more of your budget was being utilized for environmental remediation and not available for maintenance of the built asset as opposed to, or the built environment as opposed to the natural environment?
We had to, you know, the law said we had to, and shortly after 1970, it slowed down and stopped even the interstate until the judges decided we were building it according to the law.
Okay. And so you saw us changing our construction practices to conform to the federal law.
Yeah, had to.
Well, I want to thank Bob and ask that you give him a big round of applause because that is very valuable historical information.